Well, that's weird. I can hear it. Because I can hear it. Can you hear me talking?
That was Neil Armstrong and David Scott in Gemini 8. They're performing the first orbital rendezvous and docking within the Gemini.
No, I know you guys can hear me. The problem is you can't hear the audio. Okay, guys, I'm installing iShowU. We'll see if this works.
White had opened up a new frontier for Americans to explore. In 21½ minutes, EVA was completed. Now it was the 60-second revolution coming up on Hawaii. The orbital attitude and maneuver thrusters were fired to assure orbital decay and re-entry if the retrograde rockets did not fire. Now television and radio were back again. A nation paused on a Monday morning, waiting to fly in with the crew of Gemini 4.
Give him an 8-minute mark to...
Flight had opened up a new frontier for Americans to explore. In 21 and 1/2 minutes, EVA was completed. Now it was the 60-second revolution. Gemini 4 would fly the same type of orbital attitude and maneuver thrusters earlier to ensure orbital decay and re-entry. We will illustrate the re-entry of McDivitt with film from that flight. Now television and radio were back again. This is an onboard camera of Gemini 2, looking through the spacecraft window. The film is reproduced at 4 times normal speed.
Feeling great. How about you?
Gemini 4, Houston, Capcom.
Houston, Gemini 4.
Roger, you started your rolling reentry? Roger. Your weather is still very good, Jim.
Communications with the ground break off, but the onboard tape recorder is running. We listen to 2 men returning to Earth after 4 days in space.
Look at us. We're making a fire, too. Yeah, putting our ionization layer out. They're not reading us anymore now, probably. There goes Florida. Is that Florida? I believe it is. See it on your side? Yeah. They're red hot, you know. Sit back and relax. We ain't gonna do much about it from here out. No. Get ready for the cheek, Ryan. I think we got...
The thing that gets me about this sequence is that these guys are falling out of orbit like a meteor, and they're discussing the sights. They could be sitting in their living room talking about a call at a football game.
Roger, Kickapoo. We're just about ready to put the parachute up. Stand by. Okay, parachute's coming. And there's the T-read? And it's a good one, isn't it? Nobody can read me now, but does that parachute look great? You're not kidding.
During re-entry, the USS Wasp launched 13 search and recovery aircraft. Gemini 4 splashed down at 12:13 Eastern Standard Time, June 7, 1965. It was sighted by a search aircraft 7 minutes later. Navy frogmen swiftly attached the flotation collar, and at 12:39, Command Pilot McDivitt opened the hatch. Both men took a deep gulp of fresh air. 4 days in space had ended. The command pilot requested a pickup by helicopter, and in a matter of minutes, the prime recovery helicopter had the crew safely on board. They were flown to the deck of the Wasp. Admiral William McCormick, commander of the Western Atlantic Recovery Forces, and his staff offered the first formal congratulations on the flight. The crew then walked to the carrier elevator, bound for their physical examination.
Sayonara, St. Bart's. Bye-bye, Bahamas. This year.
Following the Gemini 4 flight, James McDivitt went on to command Apollo 9, which tested the Command Service Module and the Lunar Module. He then went on to serve as the program director for Apollo 12 through 16, retiring from NASA in 1972. Astronaut Roger Chaffee was a member of Group 3 and Capcom during Gemini 3. He and astronaut Ed White, who performed America's first spacewalk, died in the tragic fire on the pad with Apollo 1 and Gus Grissom. It was White's responsibility to open the hatch in an emergency. However, this required Grissom to vent the cabin, and he was unable to do it due to the fire. Even though he was unable to do so, his body was found trying to open the hatch in a vain effort to save his crewmates. Thank you all for stopping by to watch this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This is Bob the Science Guy signing out from Northern Michigan. Please remember to like and subscribe to my channel. Okay, folks, can you hear the audio here too, in addition to the audio on the If you ask the average person today what the manned space program is, you'll hear things like the International Space Station and the Space Shuttle. We see astronauts talking via satellite to high school students when performing experiments in space on long-term stays. Barring a tragedy, few of us paid attention to the shuttle launches. And once the investigations were finished, they were out of the news cycle again. Those of us with shiny adult hair remember another time, a time of Apollo. On a cold December night in 1972, I remember standing outside my home in Fort Lauderdale and watching Apollo 17 take our last manned mission to the moon. 3 years earlier, we had gathered around the black and white television in the den to watch Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon from Apollo 11. And when I was in my medical residency, we would go to the theater to learn about the right stuff of the Mercury 7. But between the heroic Mercury astronauts, the moon landings, the shuttle disasters, and the high school lessons, somebody had to teach us how to live and work in space. The 10-man missions that taught us how to maneuver in orbit, to walk in space, to rendezvous and to dock. All the routine skills and the ability to live up to 8 to 10 days in orbit. Not only learning to do the task, but training the men that would later go on to land on the moon in Apollo and command the space shuttles. This series is about Project Gemini. We'll go over each of the missions, profile the crews, discuss what they did and what they learned. It seems as though history has forgotten them, but they are the ones that helped get us to the moon. And the triumph of the shuttle and the ISS was built upon the foundation they carefully laid in the mid-60s. So join me now as we review the two-man cruise of Gemini, a bridge between Mercury and Apollo. The initial Gemini launches were basically designed to test out the systems. With Gemini 5, it was time to get to work in space. The planned 8-day flight would put America back into the record books. Gemini 5 would use a new hydrogen-oxygen fuel cell, alleviating the need for heavy batteries like the ones used on previous space flights. In addition to testing the maneuver capabilities of the spacecraft and the fuel cell, they conducted 17 scientific experiments while in flight. They also dealt with the difficult problem of sleeping in space. Initially, they tried to sleep in shifts. However, they found that when one astronaut was awake, somebody was always talking to them on the radio, waking up the other one. Eventually, they decided to work, eat, and sleep on the same schedule, relying on mission control to keep watch over them. Mercury veteran Gordon Cooper was in command of the mission. Cooper had been with the Marines during World War II. In 1949, he was commissioned into the Army and immediately transferred to the Air Force. Trained as a fighter pilot, he was selected for test pilot school in 1956 and was one of the original Mercury 7 in 1959. In May 1963, he flew the final Mercury mission, logging 22 orbits of the Earth. As interesting as Gordon Cooper was, Pete Conrad may actually be more so. Conrad had been in the evaluation group for the Mercury 7. A naval test pilot, he was all up for the idea of being an astronaut, but when it came to the medical tests, he drew the line. Like many of his fellow candidates, Conrad felt the medical testing was both invasive and embarrassing. Unlike his fellow candidates who stoically submitted to the testing, Conrad began to rebel. When ordered to provide yet another stool sample for the lab, he gift-wrapped it and put a large red ribbon on it before he dropped it off. This continued to escalate until the point that he decided he was going to drop out of the program. He did so by delivering his own enema bag onto the desk of the commanding officer of the clinic. Pete Conrad was subsequently accepted in astronaut class number 2. Gemini 5 was launched April 21, 1965. Let's have a look at news clips from the air.
This is Gemini Launch Control, now T-minus 4 minutes and 15 seconds and counting. Astronauts Cooper and Conrad still reporting the status of their spacecraft as go. We continue our checks in the blockhouse. We have now tied in the launch vehicle, the spacecraft, the control center in Houston, and the Air Force Eastern Test Range. All is go at the present time, now coming up on 3 minutes and 50 seconds and counting. This is Gemini Launch Control.
Getting into the final minutes before this launch. Astronauts in perfect condition, cheery, as you saw a moment ago. Big smiles as they were seen both leaving their sleeping quarters over on Merritt Island, and as they got suited up, and as they actually got into the spacecraft.
3 minutes and 22 seconds and counting. We're checking with a computer update. This is the spacecraft computer to ensure that it is synchronized for the launch.
We've got just 3 minutes and 2 seconds to go.
T-minus 3 minutes and counting. T-minus 3.
The voice you hear coming in is Jack King, the voice of launch control at Cape Kennedy. Immediately after launch, the spokesman will be Paul Haney from the Mission Control Center at Houston, Texas. Houston actually controls this mission.
Launch control now, T-minus 2 minutes, 24 seconds and counting. We have just received a go from the range. The range is cleared to launch.
Clearance has come from the range for launch.
This is Gemini launch control, T-minus 2 minutes and counting. We have confirmation that our computer has been updated in the spacecraft. All systems still go on the Gemini 5 countdown.
I have to get out of here.
It's time to experience the new Buick. GM employee program participants with a current eligible
1 minute, 45 seconds to launch.
Gemini launch control, T-minus 1 minute and 30 seconds and counting. T-minus 90 seconds and counting. All systems still looking good. As we approach the final seconds of the countdown, the Titan II launch vehicle will ignite. The two engines in the first stage booster will ignite as we reach 0 in the countdown. 3 seconds later, after numerous parameters have been checked, the launch vehicle will be released. We will have liftoff some 3 seconds after ignition. Now 1 minute and counting. T-minus 50 seconds and counting. T-minus 35 seconds. T-minus 25 seconds. We're now primarily on an automatic sequence in the blockhouse, monitoring the final functions as they occur. T-minus 15. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Lift off. We're off on the hour.
Let's go straight as an arrow.
Clock started and the whole program is initiated according to the report.
They should be pitching now. They're 24,000 feet, 2,400
Whole
feet.
program is complete. Pitch program has not initiated.
This is one of the Gemini fuel cells. These devices are essential for space exploration because in addition to creating electrical power, they also generate drinking water.
So here's how the cell works. Hydrogen gas is fed into a chamber on one side so that hydrogen molecules can permeate through the electrode. On the other side, oxygen permeates this electrode. In the centre is the electrolyte, a weak solution of potassium hydroxide. Although only a millimetre thick, the electrodes are almost impervious to liquids. They provide an interface between the electrolyte and the gases and act as catalysts for the half reactions. At this electrode, hydrogen, the reductant, reacts with hydroxide ions to form water. As this happens, electrons are released and flow into the external circuit. At this electrode, oxygen, a strong oxidant, grabs electrons from the external circuit and reacts with water to form hydroxide ions.
Mission Commander Gordon Cooper never flew again in space, retiring from NASA in 1970. He died in 2004, and a portion of his ashes were sent to space. Pete Conrad went on to command Gemini 11, at only 5'6" when he stepped on the surface of the moon as commander of Apollo 12. Pete Conrad joked that that may have been a small one for Neil, but it was a long one for me. Conrad's final mission to space was Skylab 2, where he served as commander. He retired from NASA and died in 1999. While our quest for space was a quest for discovery, I suspect that many people that watch YouTube nowadays don't remember the space race, the Cold War, or in some cases, even the Soviet Union. Just to get a little better feel of the national importance of the Gemini mission, let's have a listen to one of the newsreels of the time. Something as simple as recovering the spacecraft. Listen between the lines and see how this is repackaged in the terms of the Cold War. Thank you for taking a few minutes to stop by, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the series. This is Bob the Science Guy signing out from Northern Michigan. Please remember to like and subscribe to my channel.
Champlain proceeds at 30 knots, and 2 hours after taking the astronauts aboard, comes alongside the floating Gemini 5. The tiny spacecraft and its crew have set 5 world records. Through them, the United States has chalked up the longest flight in space, far topping Russian cosmonaut Valery Vygotsky's 119 hours of 2 years ago. It has amassed the greatest total of man-hours in space, nearly 640, as against the Russians' 507. This country can claim the longest multi-manned flight, the most revolutions around the Earth, and with its 9 to the Soviets' 8, the most manned flights in space.
Just in case anybody needs to borrow one, there's a ruler.
The capsule, with its priceless records, is carefully lifted aboard the carrier. Through them, the
limited edition Pure Michigan F-150 is back with custom leather interior and special Pure Michigan badging. But hurry, supplies are limited, so get to your neighborhood Michigan Ford dealer today.
The scorched heat shield shows the searing effects of re-entry. The capsule began its descent north of Hawaii, ending off Bermuda. Sharks are a hazard outer space doesn't offer. The capsule will be given rigorous examination for guidance in forthcoming space projects. Next scheduled is Gemini 6, which will be aloft only 2 days, but will try an all-important meeting and hooking up with an Agena rocket for 9 orbits. The astronauts come to take another look at their cramped little home in space. They, too, were to have rendezvoused with a satellite the Gemini itself put into space, but could not because of one of the power difficulties they experienced. This, however, was the only one of the 17 scientific experiments they planned that was not accomplished. After Gemini 6, there will be 12 to 14-day Gemini 7, probably in February. After 5 more Gemini flights, the U.S. space program will really take off into the Apollo program, whose climax will be the big shot to the moon. It's tentatively scheduled for 1969, but speedy development of the mighty Saturn V booster rocket could possibly move this up to 1968.
I find this next scene interesting. Even though we had telemetry of them from launch to splashdown, some people still required further proof.
2 $1 bills are produced as evidence that flyers Cooper and Conrad, who received them before taking off, are really themselves and not interlopers who sneaked into the capsule in space. This certifies their record to the International Aeronautics Foundation. Now it's time to relax. There's a band playing the kind of music they'd requested above, and a nice rich cake to cut. For their first meal after 8 days of capsule fare, the astronauts were allowed to eat almost anything they wanted. But after this, there will be 11 days of strict medical examination and diet. To astronauts Cooper and Conrad, it can be said, mission gloriously accomplished.
Many people have the idea that learning to draw is somehow out of reach. It's not.
Hi, and greetings from northern Michigan. This is Bob the Science Guy. Ever since I saw the first moon landing and the launch of Apollo 17, I've had an interest in the space program. This series is about Project Gemini. We'll go over each of the missions, profile the crews, discuss what they did and what they learned. It seems as though history has forgotten them, but they are the ones that helped get us to the moon. And the triumph of the shuttle and the ISS was built upon the foundation they carefully laid in the mid-60s. So join me now as we review the 2-man cruise of Gemini, a bridge between Mercury and Apollo. Gemini 6A and B was a very interesting mission. Gemini 6, under the command of Wally Schirra, was the manned vehicle, and Gemini 6B was an Aegis target vehicle. On October 25, 1965, Schirra and his pilot, Thomas Stanford, climbed into the Gemini 6 capsule. A short distance away, the Gemini 6B capsule, the Aegis target vehicle, launched from Cape Kennedy. As Schirra and Stanford completed the preparations for their launch, they listened to the 6B Aegis target vehicle blow up on the way to orbit. Needless to say, they suddenly were out of a job and their launch was canceled. Gemini 6 pilot was Thomas P. Stafford. A 1952 graduate of the Naval Academy, he was selected by lottery to be commissioned into the newly formed Air Force. In addition to the Navy, Stafford had served with the Army National Guard in Oklahoma while in high school, making him a 3-service veteran. In the Air Force, he served as an F-86 fighter pilot and a test pilot before being selected to Group 2 of the astronauts in 1962, along with Neil Armstrong. Gemini 6 command pilot Wally Schirra was one of the Mercury 7. Schirra had flown Sigma 7, which was the 6th manned Mercury mission. It was the 3rd orbital mission and the first mission to demonstrate maneuverability of a spacecraft in orbit. One thing of significance during that mission was the fact that once he was recovered and on the deck of the carrier, Schirra actually blew the door to the capsule. This deliberate action caused a very specific and characteristic injury to him, and was subsequently cited as evidence that Virgil Grissom had not blown the door on purpose, or he would have sustained the same injury. And now for the rest of the story. The mission of Gemini 6A was to meet up with an Aegis target vehicle and dock with it. As the Aegis was lost on the way to orbit, the decision was made to have Gemini 6A meet up with the next scheduled capsule launch, which was Gemini 7. Rather than actually dock in space, the decision was made to have the 2 manned spacecraft rendezvous and keep station with each other at close distance. sometimes down to as little as 30 centimeters. The Gemini 7 was designed primarily as a long-duration mission. They were to spend almost 14 days in orbit, conducting more than 20 experiments. Crammed into a capsule the size of a sports car, I'm sure that 14-day mission also tested the sanity of Borman and Lovell. The crew of Gemini 7 was rather unique in that they did not have a member of the original Mercury 7 with them. Jim Lovell was a graduate of Annapolis and a naval aviator and fighter pilot. He was first in his class at Naval Test Pilot School, along with classmates Wally Schirra and Pete Conrad. After failing the selection in the Mercury 7, he was selected in the second group of astronauts along with Neil Armstrong. Frank Borman was a fighter pilot and Air Force officer when he was selected to the second group of astronauts in 1962. He was one of 4 members of that astronaut class chosen to command his first Gemini mission.
Jim Lovell did comment that he was looking forward to a good long flight. Attending the breakfast with astronauts Borman and Lovell with Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, pilots for the Gemini 6 mission, which will be scheduled some 9 days after the Gemini 7 liftoff. The prime pilots for the Gemini 7 mission, Frank Borman and Jim Lovell, have arrived at Launch Complex 19. In their lightweight suits, they have their helmets attached.
Basically, this lightweight suit offers greater mobility and comfort for the crew, which will fly 14 days in space. However, it offers the same protection in any emergency as the standard suit. During the flight of Gemini 7, the crew will remove their lightweight spacesuit and fly in their underwear.
Did you know that according to CNBC that 1 in 3 Americans have less than $5,000 saved for retirement? And that Americans that did save for retirement have on average only $84,821, which is far from enough. Experts say that you want at least $1.3 million to comfortably retire. So let me ask you something. What's your game plan for getting yourself there? Now, maybe I can help. My name is Cody Sperber. I'm known as the Clever Investor, and I help good people just like you fast-track their bank accounts through creative real estate investing so they don't have to stress about money or retirement. Now, take Chris here. He wanted to retire, but he didn't have nearly enough saved up to just like sit around and enjoy his golden years. So I showed him how to flip houses without needing a bunch of money, experience, or credit, and how he could do it from the comfort of his own home using just his laptop or his cell phone. Now, he's making more money per deal than most people make in an entire year. And here's the thing, Chris isn't alone. I have students all over the country doing this and seeing results. Now, if you're curious on how all this works, I want to invite you to a limited seating web class. It's happening this week, where I'm going to show you 3 very important things. Now, the first thing that I'm going to show you is how you can create a successful real estate investing business, even if you don't have any previous experience. You don't need deep pockets to be able to do my strategy, so don't stress out about needing money. And I'm going to show you how to flip houses without needing to come out of pocket. Now, the second thing that I'm going to show you is how you're going to be able to go and get your first deal completed within the first 30 days. You, like me, probably want results quickly, so I'm going to show you the fastest path to a payday that I know of. And lastly, the third thing I'm going to show you is the exact scripts, the exact paperwork, the marketing pieces, and the tools and systems that I use in my business to get consistent profits. Now, I'm all about working less and getting more results, so I'm going to show you how I scaled my business to flipping over 1,000 houses all over the USA. So click the link right now and register for the free training. I don't care if you're skeptical, you're new, or if you flipped some houses in the past. The way I do things is completely different. I'm telling you, it works. Click the link and I'll see you on the training.
T-minus 1 minute and counting. The launch vehicle, first stage engines will ignite and build up some 430,000 pounds of thrust. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6,
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
Engines start. We have a liftoff.
We're on our way, Frank.
In short order, the booster for Gemini 6A was being rolled out. Meanwhile, Gemini 7 practiced rendezvousing with its booster stage.
Our initial orbit was 87 by 177 nautical miles. This was very close to what we'd hoped for. As a matter of fact, I think that our launch vehicle was closer to nominal than any other one that's been fired. After insertion, we turned around and thrusted back toward our second stage, and then we station kept or remained with the booster. Actually, we were about 60 feet away from it for around 20 minutes. About 22 minutes into the flight, we thrusted away from our second stage and then got down to the business of a 14-day long-duration flight.
We had about 20 experiments to perform in the 2 weeks ahead, but we, of course, had to check our new suits out, and we did regular medical checkups with the surgeons on the ground.
Gemini 7 is basically a medical mission. It's the culmination of our efforts to increase or double man's exposure to the spaceflight environment, ending with a 14-day manned space flight. There were 3 principal problems left following our 4- and 8-day flights. These were the ability to sleep in a spaceflight environment. Secondly, the response of the heart and blood vessels to the readaptation to the ground-based or 1G environment after being weightless. And lastly, the reduction or decrease in the number of red blood cells that is observed following space flight.
The word from the Cape is, we are go. They are go aboard Gemini 7 as they make their silent sweeps around the world on their 111th revolution.
The prime pilots for the Gemini 6 flight, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, and are now on their way to Launch Complex 19 to board their spacecraft.
The launch of Gemini 6 is scheduled at the beginning of the 118th revolution of Gemini 7.
T-minus 48, and all still going well with our Gemini 6 countdown here at Launch Complex 19. We've gone through a complete checklist once again, and we are counting.
2 to go. Go ahead, flight.
We will have ignition at 0, and some 3 seconds after ignition, the launch vehicle will lift off on the start of the Gemini 6 flight.
You're cleared for takeoff. Roger, adios. Minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Shut down, Gemini 6.
Fuel pressure is lowering slowly.
Roger, Gemini 6. Monitor tank pressures.
Oxidizer pressure is down to about 32.
Full tanks are venting.
Okay, no problem on these tanks?
Negative.
Okay, we're just sitting here breathing. This was a rough one for us. We'd been trained sufficiently, but this was different than any simulation we ever had. It did prove that man is still better programmed than any computer.
Gemini 7, Houston. We were wondering if you saw the ignition at the Cape.
We were in perfect position, but we never saw the ignition. We were waiting for the liftoff.
Roger, apparently it was on and off very quickly. We'll keep you informed.
It was a great disappointment. We'd made 2 attempts to launch and still no liftoff.
Yes, Gemini 6 failed to launch on the first attempt. Rather than punching out of the capsule using the ejection seats, they were successful in shutting the rocket down and then letting it cool off. Fortunately, they were able to turn it around and launch again in a couple of days.
Gemini 7, Caernarvon Cape Town. The thruster firings went very good on GT6. Oh, that sounds good. Roger, looks like you have company before long.
Roger, I hope the booster firing do the same.
Stand by, Mark. 20 seconds. Mark. Go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition.
Engine start.
We've got a real liftoff.
27 seconds after the hour. Flight Dynamics says the trajectory looks very good.
Rocket roll. Roll complete.
Roger, roll.
Cabin pressure sealed.
2 minutes. Our velocity now 3,700 miles an hour.
Go ahead, Canaries, Gemini 7.
Roger, well, we did it.
Roger, we saw them coming up.
Okay, their orbit is 87 by 140.
At Cape Kennedy, the American spacecraft Gemini 6 has finally succeeded in starting her journey towards the space rendezvous with Gemini 7, whose 2 astronauts have now been in space since December the 4th.
Hang on, you have to explain the whole thing to me, okay? Yeah, just
Employee frustration can be difficult to diagnose. Common symptoms may include keyboard thrashing, aggressive hair pulling, anxious sobbing, and the royal I quit. If you detect one or more of these, your team may be infected with the highly contagious software frustritis. Don't panic. WalkMe's contextual guidance simplifies any software, providing an intuitive and hassle-free user experience. Everybody wins, gets more done, with a healthy, productive workflow.
They were actually able to watch the launch while they orbited.
We cannot expect both spacecraft to be in exactly the same orbital plane. Therefore, at 2 hours and 42 minutes after liftoff, Gemini 6 command pilot Wallace Yaraw will yaw his spacecraft to the south and execute a plane change maneuver that will place his spacecraft exactly in the same orbit with Gemini 7.
The practice maneuvers of the earlier Gemini flights came into play now, as Gemini 6 maneuvered to rendezvous with Gemini 7.
Both spacecraft are now in the same orbital plane. Gemini 6, for the second time, will apply thrust at apogee to circularize his orbit at 146 nautical miles.
Okay, we're doing a little better with the mic
and
now?
to also slow his catch-up rate. At this point in time, Gemini 6 will be 15 miles below Gemini 7 and 140 miles behind. By this point in time, Gemini 6 should be within radar contact of Gemini 7.
There's just over an hour to go now before America's 2 spacecraft with their 4 astronauts on board can't meet 180 miles up in darkness over the Pacific Ocean.
At 11:25 local time, Gemini 6 spacecraft began its circularization burn. That burn was completed on schedule. The crews also have completed successfully a radar lock-on test.
And say again the range.
Range was 115.58.
All systems are looking good, flight. Tell you he's flat flying that thing. He's just as steady as can be.
When the slant range distance between Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 has been reduced to approximately 32 nautical miles, Gemini 6 will initiate the first of a series of terminal phase maneuvers. These maneuvers are accomplished by the command pilot placing the nose of his spacecraft at his target, Gemini 7, and thrusting along the line of sight. There will be 2 mid-course correction maneuvers, probably here and here. These maneuvers will place him on a trajectory that will be slightly below and in front of Gemini 7. At this point, he will perform a velocity match or braking maneuver that will bring about rendezvous. When he has completely matched the velocity of Gemini 7, he will station keep for several orbits. However, he will not dock.
The original plan was for the Gemini 6 to dock with the genus target vehicle. However, with the loss of the target vehicle on its way to orbit, the decision was made not to attempt a dock at first with two manned spacecraft. As a result, the goal of this flight was to rendezvous, to come within a foot of each other, and to fly in formation for several orbits.
7 Hawaii will be standing by if you have anything for us.
Okay. I have 0.54 nautical miles. Stand by to brake. Brake at 0.48 nautical miles. 660 feet. 300 feet. We're directly below them. 180 feet. 120 feet. Holding 120 feet, Wally.
Ask them what their range is now.
About 20 feet.
Yeah, we're sitting up here playing bridge together. We're in formation with 7. Everything is go here.
Roger, congratulations. Excellent.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Rendezvous and docking are feasible for manned crews. After we completed the rendezvous maneuver, we maintained formation. Actually, we were station keeping for a period of about 5.5 hours. Now, this included an in-plane fly-around maneuver and an out-of-plane fly-around maneuver.
During this period of time, each of us controlled spacecraft 6 for approximately 50% of the maneuvers. We separated from Gemini 7 at 6 p.m. Cape time. This was performed by a 9 feet per second retrograde maneuver. We separated to a distance of approximately 20 miles and performed experiments for the next 2 orbits.
Following the orbital rendezvous, Gemini 6 fired its retro rockets and returned to the Earth, followed by Gemini 7 several days later.
It was really a treat and docking back aboard our style on number 3 elevators. To have the realization that to accomplish the lunar mission, after we completed the rendezvous maneuver, we're still proving it, we maintained formation. And to effect rendezvous keeping, rendezvous for a period of about 5.5 hours. Bring our men back from the surface of the moon and in-plane back to the Earth, and I hope also out of number 3 elevator maneuver.
The chief
During
symptom,
this period of
in fact,
time,
the only
each of us
symptom which we
controlled
noted
spacecraft 6
was
for
heaviness of the leg.
approximately
That's all.
50% of the maneuvers. We separated
The
from
14-day
Gemini 7
mission has
at 6
shown
p.m.
us that
edema. Stafford retired from the Air Force in November 1979 as a 3-star general. He was the first general officer to fly in space. During his Air Force career, he flew over 120 different types of fixed and rotary wing aircraft in 3 different spacecraft. Frank Borman went on to command Apollo 8 and orbit the Moon. He retired from NASA in 1969 and went on to lead Eastern Airlines. He is the oldest living astronaut and is still active in restoring classic aircraft. Jim Lovell went on to command the final Gemini mission, Gemini 12. He served as command module pilot on Apollo 8 and was the commander of the ill-fated Apollo 13. Lovell retired as a naval captain in 1973. He did have a cameo role on the movie Apollo 13 as the captain of the aircraft carrier that recovered the spacecraft at the end of the movie. This is Bob the Science Guy. I hope you enjoyed this video and the ones that are to come. So let's sign out from Northern Michigan and we'll see you soon. Hi, and greetings from Northern Michigan. This is Bob the Science Guy. Ever since I saw the first moon landing and the launch of Apollo 17, I've had an interest in the space program. This series is about Project Gemini. We'll go over each of the missions, profile the crews, discuss what they did and what they learned. It seems as though history has forgotten them, but they are the ones that helped get us to the moon. And the triumph of the shuttle and the ISS was built upon the foundation they carefully laid in the mid-60s. So join me now as we review the 2-man cruise of Gemini, a bridge between Mercury and Apollo. Gemini 8 was one of the shorter Gemini flights at 10 hours, 41 minutes, and 26 seconds. Although it was short on duration, it was long on excitement. It was the first American spacecraft to dock with another spacecraft, the genus Target Vehicle, and it was also the first American spacecraft to experience an emergency in flight requiring the mission to be aborted. The pilot of Gemini 8 was David Scott, an Army graduate of West Point who elected to be commissioned in the Air Force. He trained as a fighter pilot and was stationed in Europe. In 1962, he went to the Air Force Test Pilot School under Colonel Chuck Yeager. He was the first member of Group 3, which included Buzz Aldrin, to fly in space. While his early years were spent in the Navy as a fighter pilot, Mission Commander Neil Armstrong flew as a test pilot for the X-15 program. He was selected for Astronaut Group 2 and was one of 4 members of his class selected for command on their first mission in space. Just over 6.5 hours after launch, Gemini 8 successfully docked with the genus Target Vehicle. 27 minutes an uncontrolled roll began. They broke away from the target vehicle, but the roll only worsened to 1 revolution a second. On the verge of blacking out, they managed to cut the reaction rockets and use the re-entry rockets to stop the roll. This maneuver severely depleted the fuel of the retro rockets, and although they had a 90-minute spacewalk planned, they were ordered home. Let's have a look at some footage from the time to see some of the highlights of the mission.
Ignition. Lift off. Watch star 6. Very nice. Zero. Looks good. Flight. Roger. Clock start. Fuel pressure running a little high. Roger. Roger. Stand. How's it looking, guys? Slightly good, flight. Roger. Fido. Slightly low, no problem. Roger, Fido. How about you for the stage? Thanks. Thanks to go for staging. Roger, Capcom. We're go for staging. Staging.
Now, some of you with sharp eyes may have noticed legendary Apollo flight controller Gene Kranz without his signature white vest making his first appearance with Gemini 8. Some have asked about the cameras that catch the stage separation on the Gemini Titan. These are modified quad 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns that had the machine guns replaced with cameras. Much like the weapons, the operators aimed in on the rocket with telescopic sights and fired the film.
Roger, staging. How's that thrust look, booster? That thrust is looking a little high, flight. Roger. Okay, well, status check. Booster, go. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guidance. Guidance, you go. Standby, one. Surgeon, go. Econ, go. GNC, go. How do you stand, guys?
Here we go, flight.
Roger. Capcom, where to go?
Early shutdown.
We have a Seco here, flight. Roger. Shut down.
Flight final, we had cutoff. Stand by.
Roger, final. Stand by for aviation.
WI is coming over 300 feet per second.
7295.
72 is 2. Flight final, we're no-go.
Roger. Capcom, we're no-go. Capcom, we're no-go. Roger, you are no-go. No-go.
This was not an actual Gemini mission. Nobody left the ground. Gemini did not abort. We have simply edited together an isolated launch with shots of the flight controllers simulating that launch. The flight was simulated from an adjacent room in the Mission Control Center, Houston, and like many other things in the space age, flight simulation is done by computers. The primary and backup crew for Gemini 8 will undergo 11 days of such simulated flights before launch day, March 16th. Early in the program, experts sit down and analyze the Gemini 8 flight. They know it is a 3-day mission. Its primary purposes include rendezvous in space with an Agena target vehicle, the first docking in space, and a 2-hour spacewalk by pilot David Scott. The experts then devise problems that could occur, some simple, some quite challenging. They feed these problems into a computer and sit back and see what happens. Exercises on the retrieval of a boilerplate model of the Gemini spacecraft. The Mason will cover 3 landing areas within Zone 3. It will be backed up by aircraft from Okinawa and Japan. The chief difference between the primary area where the Boxer is stationed and a secondary area such as this is the comprehensiveness of coverage, the number of aircraft, ships, and recovery specialists on station. In addition, a special launch abort area covers the landmass and immediate offshore areas at Cape Kennedy. Recovery teams go out before the astronauts enter the spacecraft in case of an ejected abort from the launch pad or shortly after liftoff. There could be more extreme contingencies. The emergency might be such that the spacecraft could not land in a planned landing area. In a dire emergency, the command pilot might have to fire the retro rockets and come right down. Bare statistics come into play here. The world is 70% water and 30% land. The odds are strongly weighted toward a water landing. Aircraft are stationed at 12 points to locate the spacecraft in this emergency. Any commercial shipping in the area might then be called for assistance to pick up the astronauts. Freighters, oilers, tankers, any ship with heavy hoist equipment could also take the spacecraft aboard. If the crew comes down over land, they would use the ejection seats, leave the spacecraft, and land by parachute. Astronauts have not only a complete survival kit to sustain them, but they are trained to live off the land, even desert and jungle. Whether Gemini comes down over water or land, recovery is planned and coordinated by a NASA team of specialists. They set up the requirements for a mission and work closely with the Department of Defense. But all of this, the red telephone and the contingency aircraft off Pago Pago Island, South Pacific, seems remote on the 16th of March. The crew is entering their spacecraft for what has every sign of being a normal flight. At the same time, on Launch Complex 14, the Atlas Agena count is only 25 minutes from liftoff. The Gemini mission is largely based on a successful orbit of the target.
Okay, guys, can you hear me okay on the mic?
The Agena count has
testing 1, 2, 3, test,
right
test,
on the
test.
nose
How's
at
the volume
10 o'clock
compared to
Eastern
the video?
Standard Time. The Atlas launch vehicle ignites. Atlas has three main propulsion engines which ignite at liftoff. Two are booster engines and one is a sustainer engine. The booster engines cut off first, some 2 minutes, 40 seconds into the flight. The sustainer engine then takes over and propels the Agena to an altitude of 654,190 feet. Two small vernier engines on the Atlas continue to position the Agena properly in the later phases of launch. But as the final figures come up to the flight dynamics officer, no in-flight burns will be needed. Agena has hit the planned circular orbit of 161 nautical miles. This is a good beginning for any rendezvous flight.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff. Roger, clock, Gemini. Yes, that's right. We got a roll program. Roger, roll. Good liftoff, 8. That's looking good. Our roll is in. We have a pitch program. Roger, pitch program.
The liftoff came as Flight Director Hodge had requested, 11:40 and 59 seconds. Gemini 8 goes into the clouds high above Cape Kennedy. As the spacecraft comes out of the clouds, an aerial chase plane picks it up for a close look at what it's like to ride as a spacecraft crew on top of a booster.
Mark, 50 seconds. You're looking good, 8.
After 50 seconds, the crew releases the restraints which are required for seat ejection. Gemini 8 was inserted into an orbit of 86 nautical miles by 146 nautical miles, very close to the planned values of 86 by 145 nautical miles.
Roger, we have staging, ignition. Roger, staging. Pushing. And we saw the Foley's fireball there.
With two good orbits, target vehicle and spacecraft, Gemini 8 had a head start on rendezvous and docking. The maneuvers for rendezvous would be essentially the same as those performed by Gemini 6. So fast does the space program accelerate that rendezvous was the primary objective of Gemini 6 in December. But 3 months later, it is March and rendezvous almost seems routine. Everyone is focused more on docking. Everyone except those who fly the mission. Then you take things step by step.
Roger, do you have solid radar lock on with the Agena? Over. That's affirmative. We have solid radar lock. Just a second, I'll give you our current range. Roger, thank you. Sounds good. We're indicating 158 miles range and elevation.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3 on the mic. Volume a little better now?
After radar lock on, the crew will circularize their orbit inside that of the target vehicle. Zone 3 will be the planned landing zone for the next 3 revolutions, for 5, 6, and 7. After that, Gemini 8 will not be over a planned landing area again until the 10th revolution. Then it passes over the eastern Atlantic zone. If an emergency occurs in the 8th or 9th revolution, the spacecraft will land in a contingency area. Recovery is supported there by aircraft and available commercial shipping. But right now, much of this seems academic. The crew has other business.
Mr. United, do you have me now?
Roger, understand. Visual, Gina 76 miles.
Hello, Houston. This is Gemini 8. We're station keeping on the Gina at about 150 feet. Way to go, partner.
You done it, boy. You done a good job.
Do the thing.
Boy, look at that sucker.
That's beautiful. See the dipole?
Do I ever? I see everything on that fella.
Man, that's great.
All right, is the microphone a little better now?
We are looking at the left or command pilot's window as the station keeping exercise with the Gina begins. Gemini 8 had no difficulty in maneuvering in the vicinity of the Agena. The onboard film, as in past flights, was at 6 frames per second and is being projected at 4 times that speed. After station keeping for 35 minutes, Command Pilot Armstrong begins to move in closer to Agena, preparing his final docking approach. Both vehicles are traveling at approximately 17,500 miles per hour.
Okay, Gemini 8, we have TM solid. You're looking good on the ground. Go ahead and dock. I think we're going to hold off on this SPC thing until he does get docked. Okay, go ahead with your memory compare. Roger. Let us know what you get out of that. Flight, we are docked.
That was it. 2 vehicles docked for the first time in space. It was about this time that Jim Lovell almost qualified as the Space Prophet of the Year. For 7 hours after liftoff and 27 minutes of normal docking, an excessive yaw and roll motion occurred. The crew punched up 400, but the trouble was not in the Agena. Unable to find an immediate answer, Mr. Armstrong undocked. The roll rate continued to build up, reaching about 1 revolution per second. Struggling to regain control, Mr. Armstrong was forced to fire the re-entry thrusters and gradually reasserted control over the spacecraft. Neither crewman experienced any loss of orientation. Gemini never approached a critical structural strain. Once the re-entry thrusters are fired, there is the possibility of fuel leakage in orbit, leaking of fuel essential for re-entry. The flight had been highly successful through 27 minutes of docking, but final action rests squarely on the shoulders of this man, the flight director. A decision came quickly. Fuel readings were too low. Abort. That was the first decision.
Okay, testing. Video and audio. Everything working great?
Available daylight in recovery zones. And the whereabouts of the USS Mason. A destroyer which had repetitiously practiced picking up a boilerplate model of Gemini in the waters of the Pacific came into its own. Millions of people suddenly learned that it existed. With Gemini stabilized in flight, there were several advantages to delaying re-entry for another orbit. The retrofire officer would have an exact reading on retrofire times, and the crew could prepare for re-entry, and aircraft could be on station at splashdown. This is the way it would be. The NASA coordinator leans over toward the DoD console. We want to recover in 7-3. The DoD manager immediately punches the button, which puts him in contact with Pacific Recovery Control, Hawaii. Hawaii alerts the captain of the Mason. He swings around and heads for 7-3, making 30 knots. Search aircraft scramble from Okinawa. They will be over the predicted landing point 10 minutes before the spacecraft splashes down. As Gemini 8 begins its 7th and final revolution, weather is excellent in the splashdown area. The crew is busy. The command pilot has time for only this brief reflection. I'd like to argue with them about going home, but I don't know how we can. That was all. Gemini 8 sweeps past Ascension Island. Retro fire will come up over Kano, Nigeria. Air-to-ground communications are broken, but the rockets fire right on the nose. The crew begins their descent through the atmosphere. This is the view they will see for a long time, the high peaks of the Himalayas. After these forbidding mountains, the sweep of the Pacific will look friendly and hospitable. Waiting for Gemini 8 are rescue aircraft circling in the landing area, ready to pick up an electronic signal from the spacecraft. 2 aircraft from Okinawa were originally assigned here, but 5 others were quickly alerted and added to the recovery team. When Gemini 8 is only 3 miles away, a C-54 catches sight of it on the main landing parachute. After that, landing is almost routine, and Gemini 8 landed within 2 miles of the predicted impact point. The first pararescue swimmer in the water is Airman First Class Neal. Airman Neal is a veteran of combat rescue work and a good man to have on your side. He was quickly followed by 2 other rescue swimmers. It was early afternoon in the Pacific, but almost 11 o'clock at night in the Atlantic, where the USS Boxer had waited. The Mason, 3 hours away at splashdown, reached the area at 3:17 p.m. local time. Crew and spacecraft, both in good shape, were soon aboard. Within 72 hours, NASA scientists would pin down the source of trouble. A short circuit in the wiring of the number 8 yaw thruster had caused it to fire erratically. The possibility of this failure recurring is slight, but a master switch has now been added to the Gemini spacecraft. The crew can throw this switch and cut off all power to the attitude thrusters in any future flight. Once the difficulty was corrected, we could take time out to realize that Gemini 8 had brought us closer to lunar exploration by demonstrating the first successful dock in space. Gemini 8 also gave many of us our first look at men like the 3 young rescue swimmers, Airman Neal and Moore, and Staff Sergeant Hewitt, as well as the captain and crew of the Mason.
Neil Armstrong was in the 2nd class of astronauts, the first civilian test pilot hired, and the first man on the moon. He retired from NASA and became a university professor and occasional public speaker after his landing in 1969. He never seemed comfortable with the fame that the landing brought him. David Scott remained with NASA as well. He became a command module pilot for Apollo 9 and was the command pilot for Apollo 15. Apollo 15 was a very successful mission, including finding the Genesis rock and performing the famous hammer and feather drop on the moon. Unfortunately, the mission was also stained by a postal cover scandal and the placing of an unauthorized but well-intentioned memorial on the moon to fallen astronauts and cosmonauts. Scott was denied promotion to 1-star general and retired from NASA in 1977. He is the oldest surviving Apollo commander. Well, thank you for stopping by and viewing this. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it, and we'll finish them up here in the next few weeks. Please remember to like and subscribe to my channel. This is Bob the Science Guy. Take care.
When you retire, you get to do something that you dreamed of. So suddenly it's your time. You get to come up with a project that's in your heart. Follow what you think is the right idea. If your heart is into it, it'll all work out.
Protect what you've earned and ensure it lasts. Bright House Financial. Build for what's ahead.
Ever
Ever since my company started using WalkMe to guide us through all of our systems and digital platforms, my work has gotten a lot simpler. If only I had WalkMe and everything else in my life. WalkMe.
Well, hi everyone, and welcome to my new series, Let's Talk About Things with Dr. Bob. Well, let's start things off by telling you a little bit about me. When I was about 8 years old, growing up in South Florida, I came to the realization that I wanted to be a physician, after spending about 2 weeks in the hospital with a bout of pneumonia. During that time, I saw what doctors and nurses did, and it kind of struck me as appealing. In high school, I took a lot of science classes, got good grades, and by the time I went to college, I began training as an emergency medical technician. That's actually 19-year-old me on the left, on a rescue call back in 1982. After a stint in the Army as a medic, I returned to college and studied biology in preparation for going to medical school. I was able to get in and graduated back in 1992. I then went to a residency training for internal medicine, and I've been in practice ever since. My specialty is internal medicine. I also have a strong interest in pain and addiction medicine and alternative health care. My motivation for starting this series is manyfold, but the main one is that medicine has changed a great deal in the last 35 years. It's become much less personal. When I was growing up, our physician was a family friend. I had many house calls, everything from chicken pox to one time I ate some tile glue and glued my jaw shut. Back then, a physician knew all of his patients because he maybe had several hundred of them. He could remember their potassium levels and their last X-ray results, just off the top of his head. Then the insurance companies got involved and the doctor's caseload went from several hundred patients, which were manageable, to several thousand, which tied us to the chart room in our offices. Due to the sheer paperwork involved, house calls just went by the wayside. Then came the internet and the electronic medical record. As a result, I was able to bring my entire office chart room with me on my laptop computer. I started doing house calls again. Fortunately, by then, not only had medicine changed, so had physicians. It seems that most were more interested in working set hours at the office than having the opportunity to care for another patient. It seems the time and the inclination to do house calls were gone. Many of my colleagues told me that for every house call they did, they could see 5 patients in the office. I just smiled and realized that for every house call I did, I got 20 new patients. Another consequence of this modern, less personal form of medicine is that patients felt that their doctors never really talked to them. My personal feeling is that patients do better when they understand their condition and work with you to help treat it. Unfortunately, this emphasis on patient education seems to be sorely lacking in modern healthcare. That was my motivating factor to doing this series. I think that each episode should highlight a particular medical condition, a common one that people have questions about. Our first one is going to be diabetes. Each episode will go over the condition on a layman's level to make sure that all questions that I've been asked on this condition in the last 30 years are answered in a 15-minute video. Talks will be general in nature. I'm not taking on your care for your condition. I'm not replacing your physician. If you have additional questions or ones that are specific to you, the best person to discuss this with is your physician or your healthcare provider. The emphasis is going to be on what the condition represents, what's its natural history, what are the signs and the complications. We'll discuss the monitoring and the treatment. We can talk about treatment strategies and even things you can do to help. These are all things that you can discuss with your physician or your provider. Topics that we're going to cover, obviously we're going to do diabetes first, but we'll also talk about high blood pressure and heart disease, pain management and addiction, hepatitis C, high cholesterol and cardiovascular risk factors, thyroid disease. I'll also be taking questions from the comments on things people want to go over. Feel free to drop me a comment and make sure you do a like and subscribe on the channel. Now we may also delve into alternative medicine a little bit. We use a cold laser in my practice for pain management, which is kind of interesting, and I'd like to share some information on that with you. As much as I would like to, I am not going to talk about medical cannabis because I don't think YouTube would appreciate that very much. I will, however, respond to messages and possibly comments. And once again, if you have a specific comment or a question you'd like me to address in this field, let me know. If I can answer it, I will. If not, maybe I'll at least point you where you need to go. Now, there are a few things that I'm not going to be covering. First and foremost is going to be cancer. I just don't have enough expertise in that to deal with all the different forms of cancer and all of the current therapies of cancer. You really need to see a specialist or an oncologist about that. And while I may briefly discuss vaccinations in this series, I am not going to be dealing with anti-vax issues. In fact, I have an entire series on vaccinations and the anti-vax movement, so if you have questions in that field, go there. Same thing goes with the other issues that I address on my channel. Now, as I said, our first episode will be out in a few days and we'll cover diabetes. When that's available, I'll put a link to that video in the description of this one. After that, I'm going to do a pretty thorough description of hypertension or high blood pressure. Depending on what's going on, I'll either do another one from my list or maybe address a viewer suggested topic. In the meantime, I want to thank you for stopping by. Make sure you hit like and subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to talking again soon. This is Dr. Bob. Take care.
3 SUVs, 1 GMC. GM employee program participants with a current...
It begins with one step, and Ascension is here when you're...
Undergo something called gluconeogenesis.
My mom's pain from moderate to severe rheumatoid arthritis was intense. I wonder...
Well, hi everyone. Okay guys, everybody hear me okay? How's the audio levels? All right, so let's go over some of these questions. Okay, plaques under the eyes. Plaques under the eyes can be a sign of high cholesterol. They're generally located underneath the eyes, and they look like they're pieces of chalk or something underneath the skin. Sugar is as bad for you as nicotine. I'll agree with that. Statins can cause problems, generally muscle aches, and that is rhabdomyolysis. That is a rare side effect of statins. But you can get some achiness in your muscles. If that happens, you need to let your doctor know about that. Now, there are other medicines that can be used instead of statins. One is niacin. Niacin is a real nice medication. It's cheap. It's a B vitamin. Now, I generally start people off slow on those, generally around 250 milligrams a day to start with, so that they start tolerating it. Now, I generally tell people to move up kind of slowly, maybe every 2 weeks, double up on the dose. But I have to be kind of careful with that. The reason that I do start them off slowly is you can get something called red man syndrome with it. Red man syndrome basically means you turn bright red and basically you're on fire. You think you're going to spontaneously combust any minute. If you start off slow, you can build it up to tolerate it. Now, don't do what my dad did. My dad's an engineer, and when a doctor tells him to do something, even if it's his son, he generally tends to follow directions very well, but sometimes you got to be careful with the directions. I told him to double up on it, thinking that we'd get him up to about 2 grams a day, which is a good dose. He went up to 7 grams a day and drove his cholesterol down to about 30. Oh, Cavalier, yes, I did house calls. Matter of fact, here, let me show you. I actually have one of these things. As a matter of fact, I have 3 of them. I had one that was a regular medical bag. I had one that was a surgical bag for doing laceration repairs and things like that. And then I had one that was just a miscellaneous one. I did great house calls, and I never charged for them, because for every house call I did, I realized that I got 20 new patients out of it. So, and since most of my house calls ended up on admissions to hospitals, I could either charge for the house call or I could charge for the admission. I like to charge for the admission. Paramedicine. I was a paramedic in Lansing, Michigan for almost 10 years. I started off at age 19 as an EMT on a basic level ambulance. I became an EMT specialist, and then I became an advanced EMT/paramedic during the Hill Street Blues era. I was the second generation of paramedics. They were still trying to figure them out. Now it's a little bit more established. I was one of the early ones. I really did like the idea of paramedics. Mr. United, I'd like to hear your story about the time you were saved. Your doctors, okay, Lauren, your doctors never talked to you. That's the whole reason that I started this series. I think that everybody that has a medical condition should have an explanation from the doctor. You know, you don't want to just walk in and say, hey, guess what? You have thyroid disease. Okay, what is that? What are you going to do about it? What's going to happen to me? Where am I going to go from here? How do you see it end? Major side effects of statin, muscle aches, yep. Bob the Man, okay, thanks, cool. 99% of people are caused by accidents, yes. If you want a child, you have to go through in vitro fertilization and spend $10 or $20,000 doing it. If you don't want a child, 50-yard line of the football field in high school works pretty well. Statins are drugs that help reduce your cholesterol. And they're one of 3 classes of drugs that are commonly used. One is statins, the other is binding agents, and the last one is niacin. Yep, use condoms. Always a good idea. Made sure all my kids had some. Yeah, what happened here? Here we go. Medical cannabinoids. I'm the largest medical marijuana certification physician in northern Michigan. What do you think my attitudes on it are? Positive or negative? I find generally that people that use cannabis can get by on a quarter of the pain medicine they came to me on. And if it went into widespread use, we could reduce the amount of narcotics written in this country by half. In states that have had legalized medical cannabis, they are seeing a 25% decrease in overdose deaths. Okay. Depression. Okay, Irish Stu wants to talk about depression. There is a couple of different ways that you can treat it, at least medically. There are 2 categories of depression. You have the type of depression where you want to sleep all the time, and then you have the type of depression that you can't sleep at all. There are certain antidepressants, Effexor and Wellbutrin come to mind, that tend to perk you up if you have the very sleepy type. If you're a smoker, Wellbutrin is a very nice one to use as well because it helps reduce your amount of smoking. If you want to have something that helps calm you down a little bit and let you get some sleep, Zoloft is a good one for that. You guys can't hear me? All right. Bob, I've got high blood pressure and cholesterol. Should I eat eggs? You know, when it comes to people with diabetes, for example, I'll never fault a man for having a piece of birthday cake at his granddaughter's birthday. I'll never fault a guy for having a beer when he gets home from work. Don't have a 12-pack every night. So if you want to eat eggs, okay, yeah, that's fine. I would not go nuts with it. All right? Can I big up the video? No. I'm kind of ugly, so you don't want to see too much of me. If you want me a little bit bigger, there, how's that? Oh, okay, Anonymous, I'd have to have a look at that first one. Tinazepam is just Restoril. I don't know what the other one is right off the top of my head. Ash Scott, dietary cholesterol has squat to do with your cholesterol level. Okay, you are correct. Now, the reason that cholesterol level was put into risk factors was as a result of what they called the Framingham study. Now, that's something that'll never happen again. Framingham was a small town in Massachusetts, and what they did was they basically tracked everybody in that town for about 30 or 40 years. And they looked at the people that had heart disease. Well, what do they have in common? They looked at the people that didn't have heart disease. Well, what do they have in common? And things like smoking and cholesterol and exercise and diabetes, those were all things that were noted. And high blood pressure, of course. Those are all things that were noted. As far as dietary cholesterol, your body makes most of the cholesterol in your body. Your diet has to do with the precursors of cholesterol. So what do we have here? So, you know, the amount of cholesterol that you eat has a small effect, maybe 10%, but 90% of the cholesterol is generated by your liver. Okay, so how can you lower your cholesterol? Exercise, choose your parents wisely so that you have good genetics, and sometimes you may need a statin drug or niacin. Depends on how bad it is, and it depends on how many effects of it you're having. Okay. Ash Scott, it's legal everywhere. Oh, you're talking about marijuana on this. Okay. It's federally illegal. And I have my own opinions about that. And the reasons for it. Do I think marijuana is dangerous for adults? No. As a matter of fact, I think the world would be a little better if we put it in the water supply. Now, with children, you don't necessarily want to do that. In the state of Michigan, there are about 50 children that are certified for the use of marijuana. I have personally dealt with about a third of them for the entire state. And in all honesty, I'm not really worried about those children perhaps having a little bit of developmental issues from the marijuana as their brains are developing. When they're an adult, I'm actually kind of more concerned with them becoming an adult than getting into MIT. What else we got up here? Yeah, choose your parents wisely. Genetics is important. And congrats to SpaceX for launching Falcon Heavy and safely landing all 3 boosters. Can you reverse Walter White? I came dressed for Halloween one year as Walter White, back when I had a goatee. Can you reverse diabetes by losing weight? Not necessarily, but you can reduce the damage or the severity of the diabetes. I used to work with a guy that weighed about 400 pounds. He went and had gastric bypass, and his high blood pressure and diabetes went away to the point he didn't need to have control with medicine anymore. Zero, my dad and 6 of his siblings all have the kind of diabetes where you can't produce insulin. That is type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes means you produce insulin in spades, but your body doesn't react to it. And as a matter of fact, that is what this episode that we're getting ready to start is about. So I'll defer to the episode. Yes, it is cannabis is illegal in the UK from what I understand, but I understand that there is a little bit of cannabis to be found in the UK, at least so I'm told. Marijuana has risk when you smoke it for obvious reasons. All right. The obvious reasons is anytime you inhale burning plant material, you are inhaling carbon monoxide. Now, cannabis does not cause lung cancer. I've never seen a study to suggest it. Now, as far as the tars and such in the cannabis, you do not smoke a pack of cannabis a day. All right? You smoke a very little bit of it. And as a result, I think that is why we aren't seeing lung disease from it or high blood pressure or heart disease. Ash, yeah, basically most things are illegal if you get caught. And if you don't get caught, let me just put it this way. There's a difference between being right and being lucky. And you have to understand the difference between the two. Carbon monoxide does suck. We lost an entire family not long ago due to a faulty heater. And there have been a lot of near or close calls on it. Now, I'm going to give another 30 seconds or so before I start this next video. Does anybody have any other ones that they want to put up? Ash, Scott, and Wales, they're starting trials on clinical weed. Yep. I was actually one of the people here in Michigan that helped get post-traumatic stress syndrome approved for medical cannabis as an approved condition. I went out, I was military, but I went out and I spoke for the 9 out of 10 people that suffer from PTSD that are not in the military. I did not, I didn't think that the military people needed much help with it, simply because they're used to doing things together in large groups, as we used to say in the Army. We're very coordinated with our efforts. But the victims of rape, the firemen and the police officers and the paramedics like me that saw stuff that we probably shouldn't have seen at ages that we shouldn't have been looking at it. These are the people here that needed. These are the people that needed the spokesman up there, and that's who I went to spoke for. Can encephalitis cause permanent brain damage? Yes, it also can cause death, which is pretty permanent. Monochromatic light source. Bob, yes, I am. How does pot help with PTSD? The way that pot helps with PTSD is basically it does not replace cognitive therapy, which is the actual treatment of PTSD. In the military, in the VA, we used to call them the bullshit sessions, where you all sit around and talk about it. My experience with PTSD personally, I never had it myself because I was not socially impaired, but I did have experience with it, and it consisted mostly of nightmares and intrusive thoughts and triggers. It took me about 5 years to get through it, and the day that the incident happened is the day that I started smoking cigarettes. I was able to get through it on my own in about 5 years. The problems that you run into with severe PTSD is that your quality of life is almost gone. And there's a very high suicide rate. Cognitive therapy, no, is not like cognitive dissonance. Cognitive means your thought process. All right, cognitive dissonance means that your thought process does not match what you're experiencing. Cognitive therapy is helping you develop coping mechanisms. So if you guys want, we'll go ahead and start the next episode, and then I'll come back again in a couple minutes. This is Dr. Bob from Northern Michigan, and welcome to Let's Talk About Things. In this series, I wanted to take a few minutes and basically kind of give the patient talk about their newly diagnosed condition. As I said in the first episode, I don't think doctors spend enough time talking with their patients anymore, and this is my way of trying to make up for that. In line of a little background on myself, I started off in medicine at age 19 on ambulances. I got my medical degree and completed my residency in 1996, and I've been a practicing internal medicine physician ever since. I also have a strong interest in pain and addiction medicine and alternative health care. I live in the middle of the mid of Michigan, and I have offices from Kalamazoo up to Marquette. In this inaugural episode, I'd like to talk about diabetes mellitus. This is a very common disease, and I've diagnosed hundreds of people with it. I've always viewed the treatment of diabetes as a partnership between the patient and the physician, and I always gave my patients a little talk when I first diagnosed them. Essentially going to give you that same talk that I give my own patients. The main characteristic of diabetes is high blood sugar. It's a problem with insulin metabolism and the ability of the body to handle sugar. Insulin is required for the metabolism of carbohydrates in the body, and diabetes is one of the earliest described diseases in human beings, going all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. Prior to the 1920s and the development of insulin, it was universally fatal in childhood. But now patients with proper management can live normal lives. There are four basic types of diabetes. There's type 1 or juvenile diabetes. The most common is type 2 or adult onset diabetes. We also have gestational diabetes and diabetes secondary to other conditions such as pancreatitis or drugs. In 2011, nearly 400 million people worldwide had diabetes, and 90% were type 2. Just a real quick breakdown of the worldwide distribution of diabetes. You see the top 3 countries now and predicted in 2030 are India, China, and the United States. Good diets and good public health education tend to decrease the rates of diabetes. Obesity and poverty tend to increase it. To go into a little bit more detail on the types of diabetes, type 1 diabetes is characterized by a lack of insulin. It can only be treated with insulin. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. Patients with type 2 diabetes tend to be obese, and the problem that they have is that they make as much, if not more, insulin than is normal, but their body doesn't act on it like a normal person would. Have diabetes due to other diseases, for example, autoimmune damage to the pancreas or pancreatitis. Some drugs can predispose you to either insulin resistance or decrease the amount of insulin produced. The final type of diabetes commonly seen is what is called gestational diabetes during pregnancy. Now, if you look at the list on that right column down at the bottom, you'll see that this generally occurs in women. Now, tell me that doctors don't have a sense of humor. Type 1 diabetes, or the lack of insulin, tends to develop early in life, generally in childhood before age 10. Type 2 diabetes generally comes up in puberty or adulthood. One of the characteristics of insulin resistance is something called acanthosis nigricans. As you notice on this patient's hand, where the folds over his knuckles are, the skin is a little bit thickened and darkened. That's acanthosis nigricans. It's also seen around the folds of the neck and under the arms. It's not seen in all type 2 diabetes, but if you see this, it's a good sign of insulin resistance. Now, as noted, there is a secondary form of diabetes related to disease or drugs. That's related to the underlying condition or the medication. Gestational diabetes occurs in pregnancy, generally in the 3rd trimester. One complication of diabetes during pregnancy is very large babies on the order of 10 pounds. Now, when we start talking about treatment, the first thing that we should really talk about is insulin itself. Dr. Frederick Banting was a Canadian surgeon who started doing some of the early work on insulin, assisted by his lab assistant Charles Best. Working with dogs, they were able to isolate the cells that produce insulin from the pancreas. Our associate biochemist James Collip was able to isolate the insulin from those extracts. For their work, they received the Nobel Prize in 1923. The first patient they treated with this extract was a child in the hospital in Toronto dying of ketoacidosis. The first American patient treated was the daughter of the American Secretary of State. After receiving the Nobel Prize, Banting sold the patent for insulin to the University of Toronto for $1. Now let's take a couple of minutes and talk about insulin, how it's made, what it does, and what organs it affects. Now your pancreas is an organ deep in the pit of your stomach, right in front of your spine, and it has two basic functions. The first function is to secrete pancreatic enzymes into your intestine to help with your digestion of your food, and that's this path down here. The second is as an endocrine organ, which means that it secretes hormones into your bloodstream. One of the major ones, of course, being insulin. Now, insulin starts off as a large molecule called proinsulin. It's a big spiral molecule with two cross bonds in it. Now, an enzyme will break off the tip of it right here and create two more molecules. One is called a C-peptide, and the remainder of the proinsulin is insulin. So that's the insulin, and that little fragment there is called the C-peptide. That'll be important later. You can see how the pancreatic enzymes go into the gut, and then the insulin goes directly into the blood. The proinsulin is cleaved by the enzyme, forming a C-peptide on the left and insulin on the right. Now, insulin affects several different structures in the body. It affects the fat cells, it affects the liver, and it affects the muscles. Your body's abilities of self-preservation are amazing. If you are starving, your liver will actually undergo something called gluconeogenesis and create glucose. Under conditions of low blood sugar, your fat will break down and create glucose and fatty acids. And finally, your muscles will start breaking down and generate glucose.
Did you know that high blood sugar and diabetes symptoms have nothing to do with eating carbs or sugar? Recently, a doctor from Arizona has uncovered a beta cell secret for fighting the real cause of high blood sugar and diminishing diabetes symptoms. He's created a short video presentation that reveals his research in full and shows a simple solution that could help naturally balance blood sugar levels. Click the Watch Now button to learn more about this discovery.
Will actually undergo something called gluconeogenesis and create glucose. Under conditions of low blood sugar, your fat will break down and create glucose and fatty acids. And finally, your muscles will start breaking down and generate glucose from that as well to keep your body alive. In times of plenty, when you have plenty of sugar running around in your blood, your liver will build up glycogen for future use. It'll store fat for future energy uses, and your muscles will absorb amino acids and bulk up. Now, many people with type 2 diabetes have something called metabolic syndrome. They have central obesity, high blood pressure, high blood sugar due to insulin resistance, high triglycerides, and low HDL, or good cholesterol. They are predisposed to a number of conditions to include heart disease, strokes, and diabetes. Now let's discuss the treatment of diabetes. All treatments for diabetes begin with diet. In some cases, we will need insulin. In other cases, we can treat the insulin resistance with oral medicines. Now, one thing that I mentioned when we talked about the secretion of proinsulin, remember that enzyme cleaved off the C-peptide and made C-peptide and insulin. One of the ways you can tell what type of diabetes somebody has between type 1 and type 2 is whether or not they have any C-peptide in their blood. If they don't have any C-peptide, they are not making insulin, and they are a type 1 diabetic. As I mentioned a moment ago, if you are a type 1 diabetic, you must be treated with insulin. If you do have C-peptide, you're a type 2 diabetic, and there's a possibility of treating you with oral medicines. Now, as I said, the treatment of diabetes begins with diet. If you are a diabetic, you do not have flexibility in your diet. Each meal should be taken at a set time of day. You should always eat breakfast about the same time, eat lunch about the same time, eat supper about the same time. The goal of this diet is not necessarily to count calories. It's to make sure that your breakfast is a consistent caloric intake, your lunch is a consistent caloric intake, and your supper is a consistent caloric intake. So for example, if you have a cup of oatmeal, some brown sugar, some fruit, and a glass of orange juice and a cup of coffee for breakfast, make that your standard breakfast every day. As time goes on, you can work with a dietitian and you can find 3 or 4 different breakfasts that have approximately the same number of calories. So one day you can have oatmeal, the next day you can have bacon and eggs. But you need to kind of get an idea of what one is equivalent to another. The same thing for your lunch and your supper. What I always tell my patients is that the amount of food that they eat should fit into the palm of one of their hands. No more, no less. The key to it is consistency. I want your blood sugar at 9 o'clock this morning to be exactly the same as it was at 9 o'clock yesterday morning and what it will be at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. My medicines will not help you if your blood sugars are all over the map every single day. It's like trying to hit a fly with a BB gun. Now let's talk about the different insulin therapies with the different types of insulin. When do we use them? How do we use them? How do we choose which one to use? Now, to understand proper insulin therapy, we want to remember the normal body's reaction to glucose. That's the top graph up there. We have a baseline level of sugar in the blood and a baseline level of insulin. As we eat, we get a bolus of glucose that comes in, and we get a squirt of insulin from our pancreas to cover that and bring us back down to normal. The first type of insulin that came out was made from pigs and cows. Basically, it was what we call regular insulin. It was short acting. The way that we used it was that every time we ate, we would go ahead and take a shot of regular insulin to try and cover that bump in our sugars and keep our sugars in a normal level. Well, that's very short acting and very as needed. To improve that a little bit in the 50s, we came out with something called NPH insulin or N-insulin. N-insulin was an intermittent acting insulin. It generally was given in the morning to cover the lunch and at lunchtime to cover supper. It also had a little bit of baseline action in between, so it was a little bit better than our insulin. In the late 90s, we developed what's called Lantus insulin. It is a single 24-hour insulin shot that you take once a day. It mimics the baseline insulin of our body because it releases insulin slowly all day long. Now, for meals, we go ahead and use a short-acting R insulin to cover those. This mimics the normal body's reaction to sugar very closely. Now, while insulin can be used with all types of diabetes and is in fact required to be used in type 1 diabetes and generally in gestational diabetes as well, for type 2 diabetics, which are the majority, we can use oral medicines. Now, while we understand that insulin just replaces the body's insulin that is needed, oral medicines generally tend to hit the exact cause of type 2 diabetes. Number one, they cause the pancreas, which puts out some insulin already, to put out even more to overcome the insulin resistance. The second way that it'll work is that it'll actually work on those insulin receptors and make them work a little bit better. A classic example of that is metformin or glucophage there to the right. And the last way that they work is they tend to decrease the absorption of sugar by making you spill it out in your gut. For most of my type 2 diabetics throughout my practice, I use combinations of the first two and occasionally had to add some Lantus insulin or the long-acting insulin for some of my really high problem cases. Now, we monitor your blood sugar in three basic ways. The first is that we do blood sugar testing where you do a finger stick several times a day, generally before meals. Sometimes they'll ask you to do one in the middle of the night to check for something, but it's generally just before you eat your meals. About every 3 months in the office, we'll get a blood test called a hemoglobin A1C. A hemoglobin A1C is a blood test of the hemoglobin molecules. And what happens is, as these hemoglobin molecules are exposed to blood sugar, they rust a little bit, is the easiest way to describe it. The higher the sugar concentration in the blood, the more rust we get. It's a good estimate of what your blood sugar was over the last 3 months. A normal blood sugar is about 100, and a normal hemoglobin A1C is about 6.5%. For every percent above 6.5, your blood sugar on average is about 30 milligrams higher. So if your blood sugar is about 130, you would expect a hemoglobin A1C of about 7.5%. 8.5% would be an average blood sugar of 160, and so forth. I've had about 12 or 14 patients in my practice that came in with hemoglobin A1Cs around 25%. Most new diabetics come in between 12 and 14%, and we get them down to about 6.5–7% within a couple of months. Another thing that we have to have a look at is we need to monitor the patient for two things. One, the medications that we use to treat diabetes can be hard on the liver and the kidneys, so we want to keep an eye on those. Second, diabetes itself causes damage to your eyes, damage to your kidneys. It is the leading cause of non-traumatic below-the-knee amputation due to foot infections. So we need to really keep a close eye on your health in general. And as a diabetic, it is essential you inspect your own feet every single day, including turning them over as best you can and looking at the bottoms. I've had many patients that came into my office just for their routine exam. I did a foot check on them and found a thumbtack in their heel. Now let's take a moment and go over glucose testing, and we'll see how we record those tests and how we evaluate them. When you have a nice tight dot like this, I can move these around and get them to where they need to be. However, if you have something that looks like this, and it's all over the place during the day, is that good? Is it low? Or is it high? The problem is I need this tight in order to move it because I don't know what to do. Do I drop it down? Do I bring it up? And that'll affect the medicine out here or back here. So you've got to keep these tight like that. So let's talk about meals for a minute. 1, consistent. Time, amount of food. 2, have a couple of breakfasts, lunches, dinners, that are all about the same calories. Rule of thumb. Fit the meal in palm of hand. Most people have a hand. And if you can't put your meal in that hand, you're eating too much food. So try and make your diet as consistent as possible, both on time and amount. Now, taking a little closer look at that, you see on the left, all of your morning blood sugars at 7 a.m. are in this little dot right here, and they're in the normal range where we want them. If you go over to 11 o'clock, you see the dots are all in a nice tight pattern, but they're a little high. And all the way over on the right at 9 o'clock, you see they're all in a tight pattern, but they're a little low. I know what to do with those blood sugars. I need to move the 9 o'clock one up a little bit, and I need to move this 11 o'clock one down a little bit. But look at your 4 p.m. blood sugar just before supper. You see how those dots are just literally shotgunned all over the place? You're not controlling your diet very well, and that's your lunchtime meal. So what you need to do is tighten up your lunch meal and get these sugars tightened up a little bit before supper. Now that way there I can move your blood sugars around a little bit and get all of them in that normal range. It's very important for me to be able to do that, and I need your help to do it. You need to be very consistent with your diet. Now we do have some pretty significant problems with diabetes. The first and foremost is something called diabetic ketoacidosis. Now one thing I want to clarify with ketoacidosis. If you are a type 1 diabetic and you do not have enough insulin, what happens is your body cannot use sugars. As a result, your fats break down and form ketones. Your body can use these ketones for energy. Most of your body at least. Your brain, however, needs sugar. And to use that sugar, it needs insulin. If you don't have the insulin, you become unconscious pretty quickly. Because of the excess sugar, your body tries to urinate it out and you become dehydrated. Ketone metabolism makes you very acidotic. Your blood becomes very vinegar-like. If untreated, diabetic ketoacidosis is fatal very quickly. As it is, you're going to be in the intensive care unit for a few days while they fluid resuscitate you and get your insulin and sugars under control, and probably spend a week in the hospital after that. This generally occurs in type 1 diabetics, but can, on rare occasions, occur in type 2. It is a life-threatening emergency. As I mentioned, diabetic foot infections are the leading cause of non-traumatic below-the-knee amputations in the United States. You also have a higher than normal incidence of heart disease, kidney failure, and stroke. You can also get significant erectile dysfunction. Well, that was a quick 20-minute overview of 3 years of medical school. So this is good information on a patient level to kind of give you some idea of what we're doing with diabetes. Every doctor has their own technique of how they want to approach diabetes. We all follow some basic standards, but we all have our own little way of doing things. So something that I particularly like to do, your doctor may not like to do, and vice versa. It doesn't mean either one of us are wrong, it's just different approaches to the same problem. When in doubt, always do what your physician asks you to do. And if anything, this presentation may give you some good questions to ask your doctor the next time you see him. Well, thank you for stopping by. I'm glad that we had a few minutes to get together and talk about diabetes a little bit. It's a very interesting subject and requires a lot of cooperation between the doctor and the patient. So hopefully now you're a little better prepared for it. We'll see you soon. This is Dr. Bob signing out from Northern Michigan. Please remember to like and subscribe to my channel so you'll get updates on these and other videos that I put out.
Managing my type 2 diabetes wasn't my top priority until I held her.
Not well.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you for stopping by for a quick chat. This is Dr. Bob, and today we're going to go over one of my favorite subjects, and that's chronic pain management. Approximately 1 in 5 people that comes into a primary care office comes in with a complaint of chronic pain. But very few primary care doctors are trained extensively in chronic pain, and with new regulatory actions by the state and federal government, many of them are shying away from it. I think that's a shame, and it's a disservice to patients. Well, let me go ahead and reintroduce myself. I started off in medicine at age 19 as an EMT on the ambulances. I graduated from my residency in internal medicine in 1996, and I've been treating patients in internal medicine ever since. Now, for most of my career, I treated the chronic diseases of adulthood as an internal medicine doctor. However, I've got a lot of interest in pain and addiction medicine, and as well as alternative healthcare, and that's what I've been doing mostly for the last few years. I created this series because I think that doctors and patients are not communicating as well as they could. Too many times when patients get a diagnosis, the doctor just doesn't have time to sit down and give them a 15 or 20-minute talk on that condition and what they can do. In this series, I'm giving you my 15 to 20-minute new patient talk when somebody is diagnosed with a new disease, or I take them on as a new patient and I go over their medical history. I'm not here to replace your doctor, nor am I offering to treat you or giving you medical advice. I'm simply giving you the background information that I like to give my patients when I work with them. Today I'd like to talk to you about chronic pain. This is a very challenging but very rewarding field that I have worked with for a number of years. There truly is an art to good pain management, and even though you may use some of the same medications, each program has to be tailored to the patient, and you need to really work with the patients on an individual basis. First, let's go ahead with some definitions. Now, we all have our own definitions. There are some basic standards, but we all have our own way of doing things. I consider chronic pain as pain that lasts 3 months or longer than is expected given their condition. It's bad enough that they need to talk to me about it, and it impairs their activities of daily living. The pain stops them from doing the things that make them them. Now, the interesting thing is this last point. It involves both physical pain and a psychological response to that pain. Many folks have heard the term pain and suffering and seem to kind of look at them together. In reality, they're two different things. The pain is the physical aspect of the chronic pain. The suffering is the psychological response to being in pain chronically, day in and day out. It wears on you. It decreases your zest for life. It can be very depressing. There are 3 basic types of pain. Somatic pain is body pain. It's a sore muscle. It's the pain from a broken limb. It's something that you can actually locate and put your finger on. Visceral pain is internal pain from internal organs. The pain of appendicitis, for example, is a visceral pain. And finally, you have neuropathic pain. Neuropathic pain, a good example of that would be diabetic neuropathy. Each has a different cause and requires a different approach to management. And remember, the goal is to return to function. It's not to be pain-free. That last point is very important. The goal is to be functional, not pain-free. I like to use about a 50% reduction in pain. No matter what your pain level is, if I can cut it in half, you're going to feel a lot more functional. Now we have a problem with pain management right now, and that is basically our fault. When I was a resident back in the 90s, the standard was that if your patient reported any pain and you did not completely get rid of that pain, you were wrong. That was a hit on your JCO evaluations. The pain was the fourth vital sign, they said. The other thing that was really bad for medicine and patient care was the attitude in the 90s that if a patient had true pain and you gave them narcotics for it, they wouldn't become addicted. The only people that would become addicted would be the people that took narcotics for the side effects rather than relief of actual pain. Looking back at this, it's ludicrous. And I think that you can see from the statistics here that for every 100 patients, we've been giving up to 82 prescriptions of pain medicine per year. That's ridiculous. Now, the unfortunate thing is that as a result of this rampant use of pain medicine, the states and even the federal government have had a huge crackdown on it. Doctors now are almost afraid to treat pain for fear of repercussions from their state medical boards or even law enforcement. It seems that they're looking at it as a criminal justice issue rather than a public health and a patient care issue. I've never agreed with that and actually have taken a few lumps myself for it. I'm a firm believer in a pain patient's Bill of Rights, and in Michigan, where I practice, we actually have one in the statutes. Now, the pain patient Bill of Rights is very simple. There's only 3 parts to it. You have a right to have your report of pain accepted by your doctor as factual until you give them reason to think otherwise. In other words, if you tell your doctor that you're in pain, you have a right to expect that they're going to do something about it, to address it in some way. This doesn't mean the candy store is open. It means that you may get something that you weren't anticipating, such as physical therapy or Tylenol, but at least they need to address it. And finally, simply because you're a chronic pain patient, that doesn't give anybody the right to treat you as a drug addict or a drug seeker. You're taking a medication for a medical condition, chronic pain. If you take it appropriately, nobody should look at you as a drug addict. Now, one other thing on this slide that I'd like to touch on is this pain scale. So often patients come in and they walk into your office, they walk into your exam room, they hop up on the exam table and you ask them, how's their pain today? And they say, Doc, it's 9 or 10. Let me make something very clear. If your pain is a 10, you're not in my office. You're in the hospital or you're in your bed. Pain level 1 means that you just notice it. Pain level 6 means that you're starting to really walk with pain, etc. If you're an 8 or a 9, you're barely able to move. And you certainly aren't just routinely going to the doctor's office. If you've got a pain level of 10, you're pretty sure you're dying. So if a doctor asks you what your pain scale is, give them a real number. To give you an idea, a broken arm is probably about an 8. Let's go over a couple of the components of chronic pain. First, you have physical discomfort of varying levels. Second, you have limitations to your lifestyle. There are things that you just can't do anymore. Not because you're not interested in them anymore or you're physically not in the shape to do them, but simply the pain is limiting your ability and it hurts too much to go out and shoot a bow and arrow or go fly fishing or work in your garden. And then there's the psychological response to pain. Picture a 27-year-old woman with lupus. A 27-year-old woman should be out biking and playing tennis and dancing with her friends and doing adventures. She shouldn't be sitting on the couch, afraid to move because her joints hurt so much. Think about what that will do to her psychologically. Will she be the outgoing woman that she normally would be? No, I don't think so. I think the thoughts of how unfair this all is would occupy much of her day. To effectively treat chronic pain, you need to address all three aspects of that pain. Now let's talk briefly about the medical approach to pain. I'm going to start off with the use of pain medicine. As always, the very first thing that we need to do is start with realistic expectations. The goal of pain management is to return to an acceptable quality of life, not to be pain-free. A reduction of pain by 50% will normally improve the quality of your life, and it is achievable with minimal medicines. Now let's have a look at the use of short versus long-acting pain control. Okay, so let's have a quick look at pain. Now, if we look at a day, what we're going to do is we're going to see a baseline level of pain, and then we're going to see a couple of spikes, which can come with some activity. Now, there are two ways that we can treat this. One is with short-acting narcotics, such as hydrocodone. Now, if you look at hydrocodone, it lasts about 4 hours. So what you would have to do is basically take 6 doses to cover yourself for 24 hours. This is not very practical because with hydrocodone, in 6 doses of it, you're going to have close to 2 grams of Tylenol or acetaminophen. That's a very toxic medicine to your liver. Now, another way that we can do it is we can use a longer acting medicine. The one that I particularly like is methadone, and I'll give you some reasons for that in a moment. But basically, it has got the same type of pain control that hydrocodone does, except it lasts a couple times longer. Now, methadone is kind of a cool medicine. First, it's extraordinarily inexpensive, and second, it has no secondary effects. For example, some medications, if you take them, they have a pain-killing effect to begin with, and then as they go through your liver, they're converted into something else that has a pain-killing effect. So you have to worry about basically dosing them with 2 different drugs at once. But let's see how we can combine these two to get a little better pain control. So what we'll do is we'll basically take our day, and we've got our baseline pain, and we've got a couple of spikes. And what we're going to do is we're going to give somebody a longer acting medicine to cover these baseline pains, and then we can use the short acting medicine to cover the spikes. Now, with methadone, the maximum dose of that that's really effective is about 30 milligrams a day. So what I would typically do is I would give 5 milligrams, 5 milligrams, and 5 milligrams. Then if we look at the hydrocodone preparations, those are generally 5 or 10 milligrams per dose, plus 325 milligrams of Tylenol. I'd start off with a 5, or I'd give them a 10 and have them cut it in half and take half of one to cover these spikes. And I always thought that was a very elegant way of doing this. Now, a couple of things that you should think about. One is minimal meds. 2, 50% reduction in pain is what you're shooting for. And 3, no more than 3 doses of short-acting narcotics per day. I don't know how many people came in to me on 4 to 6 doses of Norco every single day. And a lot of their doctors will say, well, I don't have a special license to use methadone. Methadone is a pain medicine. The special license that you need to use methadone is when you're doing it for maintenance therapy and addiction. You can use methadone to treat pain all day long. And I would typically give 5 or 10 milligram tabs. And I'd do it up to 3 times a day. No more. In my practice, if you looked at my pain management patients, 95% were covered with this regime of 3 times a day methadone and no more than maybe 2 hydrocodones. So it's really not that difficult. Now there's another thing that I wanted to show you about pain medicine. A lot of people seem to think that as the dose goes up, if you look at the pain, it's going to follow a pattern like that. And that kind of makes sense. If you start off with 0 and you have a lot of pain, as you add more medicine to it, you would think that the pain goes down. But that's not really what happens. What happens is this. So you start off at 0, you come on out, and then you start getting an effective dose, and your pain comes down. And then as the dose goes back up, your pain can actually come back even more than when you started. This is called narcotic-induced hyperalgia. Now the key to this is find the sweet spot right there. So I had a lot of patients that came on in and they were over here. So what I did was I started weaning them down on their medicines, maybe about 10% a month. That way there they don't run into problems with the withdrawal beyond maybe feeling a little fluish, you know, every time I reduced them. But their pain would go down. So as I backed them down, what I would do is I'd wait until I got the minimum amount of pain, and then if I backed them down any further and their pain went up a little bit, I knew that I had just passed it, so I brought them back to here. There's an art to doing good pain management. And remember, minimal meds. Now there's one other thing I want to talk about. Why is it that if you look at medicines like Percocet and Vicodin and Norco, they always have Tylenol in them? Now the reason for that is that if you take a narcotic, there's a certain amount you have to use to get pain relief. All right, so let's say that's 10. We'll just use that as a number. Now, if you look at a Tylenol-like medicine, or Motrin, which is called a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, even if you give the maximum dose, you might get incomplete pain relief. However, if you combine them and use the narcotic and non-steroidal and go to pain relief, you may be at a 5 on your narcotic, and you may be on a relatively minor dose of a non-steroidal. The reason being is you need a big dose of narcotic to get a big effect. You need an even bigger dose of a non-steroidal to get a big effect. But if you go half and half, you have small dose, small side effect, but you get the same big effect. The Tylenol or the Motrin boosts the effect of the narcotic, so you need less of it. Now, just to reiterate, do not use short-acting pain medicines for long-acting pain. Use a combination therapy and tailor it not only to match the characteristics of the pain, but address the cause of the pain. I'm a big believer in the synergistic use of narcotic and non-narcotic pain medicines. Now, there are a couple of other classes of medicines that we can use in addition to or instead of the non-steroidals. The first one is anti-seizure medicines like Neurontin and Lyrica. These are very good to potentiate the narcotics, and they're also extremely effective in neuropathic pain like diabetic neuropathy. Now, another set of pain medicines that we can use is the antidepressants. Not only do these help with the pain, they also help with the suffering. And recall that on most antidepressants, you need to take them for a full month before you can determine if they're working. Now let's talk about the characteristics of pain a little bit and the different types of pain. Now, as you can see from these charts, there's 6 different pain patterns with headaches, for example. And there are typical symptoms that you would get with, say, neuropathic pain such as diabetic neuropathy. As I mentioned earlier, somatic pain is generally very localized to the surface of the body. It's where you have the cut. It's where you have the broken arm. It's where you have costochondritis. You can take a finger and point to it and push on it and reproduce the pain many times. Visceral pain tends to be much vaguer, and it has referral patterns sometimes. Think about the pain of a heart attack, which is a dull pain in the chest that refers out into the left arm. Another good example of visceral pain is the spastic pain of a kidney stone that radiates down into your groin, or the gallbladder pain that goes up into your right shoulder. Neuropathic pain, on the other hand, is characterized by burning, and it generally tends to follow one of 2 patterns. It'll either follow a nerve, like you would see with shingles, for example, or it has to do with the length of the nerve, which is what's going on in diabetic neuropathy. The longest nerves are the one that goes to the feet. And then after that rises up towards your knees, it'll start affecting your fingers. An example that many people are familiar with neuropathic pain is the pain of sciatica, coming from your back and going down your leg. While all respond to pain medicine, many times you need to treat the underlying cause, and sometimes with the different types of pain, like the neuropathic pain, you use additional medicines such as the anti-seizure medicines that I discussed earlier. Now, we can also approach pain with non-opiate modalities. Examples would be physical therapy or chiropractic care. We use a red light laser in my office, which is very effective with pain, and it's really helped my shoulder in particular. The other thing is many states in the United States have legalized an alternative substance for pain control, and that is extraordinarily effective. especially on things that are not well managed by traditional medicine at this time. It is my personal feeling, based on 10 years' experience, that if that was in widespread use, we could reduce the amount of narcotics prescribed by 50%. These medications basically give a boost to your mainstream pain medicines, with a goal of making those medicines not only work better, but require lower doses. The lower the dose, the fewer the adverse side effects. Now, as far as monitoring a pain management program, many states now and many countries have a prescription reporting program. I am a firm believer in pulling that report every single office visit. That'll tell me every controlled substance that you receive from any doctor at any pharmacy in my state. We also do urinalysis for substance abuse and risk factor assessments with psychological tools like the CAGE questionnaire. These are things that are very important to do on a regular basis and randomly. I let my patients know that they get a drug test the first time they come in, and then they're going to get another one within the next 3 to 6 months, and that'll be at a time of my choosing, based on 3 factors. 1, I'm suspecting that you're not doing what I'm telling you to do, or not taking your medicine. 2, I get a whim. Or 3, it's been a little while since your last one, and by a little while I mean 3 to 4 months. Now, another thing that I try and stress with my patients, and that is that if you are not getting good pain control, I want to know about it, and I will adjust your pain management. By the same token, if you're not using all of the medicine that I'm giving you, tell me about it. You know, having a day or 2 supply laying around just for emergencies is one thing. Having 60 pills of hydrocodone in your kitchen is just a danger sign to me. We see many practices that just routinely give the same doses of medicines in the same quantities month in and month out, and the patients are complaining they don't have the room to store all the bottles. And finally, come on in pretty frequently. I have my patients come in once a month for this, and I keep very good records on it. I'm very curious as to how the pain medicine's working for you. Are you getting the relief that we're trying to achieve? Can I reduce you? And that is a question that I ask every single visit. Now, a problem that we're running into right now is that it's very difficult to get good pain management from your primary care doctor. Lots of times, doctors wonder whether or not you're being truthful with them about your pain. That is a matter of rapport between you and your doctor. Second, many doctors have relatively poor training in pain management, and despite all of the headlines and the press releases that the state puts out, the medical board really takes a hard line on physicians that prescribe pain medicine. Pharmacists many times feel pressure not to stock pain medicine, much less dispense it, and they scrutinize every prescription. Many insurance plans and employers severely limit the amount of pain medicine that patients can be prescribed, or simply refuse to allow their providers to prescribe pain medicine, insisting that they be sent to quote-unquote specialists. Finally, is 2 things that are relatively unfair. We all have our horror stories with pain management patients, and many of us know good doctors that were persecuted by law enforcement and the state medical board over their prescribing habits, even if those prescribing habits were extremely reasonable and justified. It is a headline maker for local law enforcement to bust a doctor. And even though they take some of the bad ones off the street, they also take an awful lot of good ones with them. Well, thank you very much for stopping by and having a quick listen to me. We do have some good topics coming up. We've got headaches, cholesterol. We're going to do some user questions, and next week we're going to go over addiction, which is another one of my favorite subjects. To tip my hand a little bit, I am a very firm believer that if you are a physician prescribing pain medicine, you need to have an exit strategy and the ability to take care of the problems that pain medicine can cause. So the training for it is relatively simple. It's only 8 hours. Follow through with your patients is my motto. This is Dr. Bob signing out from Northern Michigan. We'll see you next week. Well, hi everyone, this is Dr. Bob from Northern Michigan, and welcome to Let's Talk About Things. In this series, I wanted to take a few minutes and basically kind of give the patient talk about their newly diagnosed condition. As I said in the first episode, I don't think doctors spend enough time talking with their patients anymore, and this is my way of trying to make up for that. In line of a little background on myself, I started off in medicine at age 19 on ambulances. I got my medical degree and completed my residency in 1996, and I've been a practicing internal medicine physician ever since. I also have a strong interest in pain and addiction medicine and alternative health care. I live in the middle of the mid of Michigan, and I have offices from Kalamazoo up to Marquette. In this inaugural episode, I'd like to talk about diabetes mellitus. This is a very common disease, and I've diagnosed hundreds of people with it. I've always viewed the treatment of diabetes as a partnership between the patient and the physician, and I always gave my patients a little talk when I first diagnosed them. Essentially going to give you that same talk that I give my Well, hi everybody, and greetings from Northern Michigan. This is Dr. Bob. I want to thank you for stopping by today. I'd like to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that's addiction medicine. To give you a little background on myself, I've been a practicing internal medicine physician since 1996. While initially I started off taking care of the chronic diseases of adults, I kind of gravitated towards addiction medicine and pain control. I also do quite a bit of work with alternative medicine. It was always my habit to have a talk with my patients when I diagnosed them with a new condition. I wanted them to understand what was going on and how I planned on approaching it and where they were going from here. I started this series because I don't think doctors are talking with their patients quite as much as the patients would like. And although I'm not taking you on as my patient or suggesting medical care for you, I thought that I would share my patient talk with you so you could gain some understanding of your condition. In addition to the series introduction, this is the third episode, the first being diabetes, the second being chronic pain, and today, as I said, we're going to go over addiction. In future episodes, we may talk about alcoholism and perhaps addiction to benzodiazepines. But in this one, I'd like to concentrate primarily on addiction to opiate pain medicines. Now, those of you that follow the news know that we're in the midst of an opioid crisis. And this is because all narcotic or opioid medications are addictive in any dose if they're taken over time. That's just the nature of their chemistry. Now, there's a couple of terms that I think are important. The first one is tolerance. Tolerance, as far as opiates goes, means that you need to take more of the medicine to get the same effect over time. This can in turn lead to dependency, which means that you will get symptoms of withdrawal if you suddenly stop these medicines. And finally, addiction means that you are actively seeking the medicine to avoid symptoms of withdrawal. This can extend to the point that you do things that you normally would not do, such as steal medicines from other people or obtain them by illegal means. But I think one of the earliest signs of actual addiction is telling little white lies to your provider, exaggerating your symptoms to make sure that you have an ample supply of medication available. Now, one other thing that I want to add to this slide is that most people that are addicted to opiate pain medicines obtain those medicines initially as a form of pain management for an injury or a painful condition. One thing that I always try and stress with my patients is that addiction to pain medicine is not a defect in character, it's pain management gone wrong. That accounts for over 50% of all heroin addicts. Now, the remainder are mostly people that had errors in judgment and tried narcotics for recreational uses and it got away from them. In this video, I would like to go over the two effective treatments for narcotic addiction. You'll notice that simply stopping and going cold turkey is not listed here, and that is because it has a very high failure rate. In fact, in my opinion, it's more punishment than effective medical care. The two best approaches, in my opinion, are maintenance therapy with methadone or weaning a patient off of narcotics with or without medical intervention. But we need to keep in mind that any effort to wean a patient off does take time and must be done in a stepwise manner. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are in the midst of an opioid crisis. As you can tell by the graphic, this affects a large number of people, and in fact, in 2015, death from narcotic overdose outstripped automobile accidents as the leading cause of accidental death in young adults. Now, physicians are not blameless in this problem. Back in the 90s, when I was a resident, pain was considered the fourth vital sign. We were told that if you gave narcotics to somebody for pain and they took them for pain, they would not become addicted, and if a patient reported any pain at all, it was considered a hit on our JCO evaluations. The resulting massive increase in narcotic prescriptions being written by doctors started this epidemic. It's come to the point now the states are actually cracking down on it, limiting the amount of prescriptions that can be written. As a result of the excessive number of narcotics written for in the early 90s and the addiction problem, we've actually swung the opposite direction, and now it's very difficult to obtain adequate pain control, even for people that clearly need it. This has reached almost absurd levels. In fact, when my daughter's cat had bladder stones removed, the veterinarian sent the cat home on Neurontin, which is an anti-seizure medicine rather than actual pain medicine. One good thing that came out of this is the DATA 2000 office-based treatment with buprenorphine. And while this is a very good approach to the problem, it is more of a good intention because actually putting it into place is a little more difficult than you would think it would be. Now let's go over the physiology of opiates and addiction in some detail. Your body has something called mu receptors, which are actually like locks, and the narcotics or the opiates are the keys to those locks. In short, if you take an opiate, it binds to one of these receptors and triggers a response, and that response is to change your perception of the pain to the point that you no longer feel that pain as pain. Those receptors also have some unwanted side effects such as respiratory depression and constipation, but we won't be going over those here. Now, your body normally has a certain number of mu receptors in your tissues. As you take narcotics and opiate pain medicines over time, the number of those receptors increases. Now, in order to get an effective response from the opiates, you have to have a certain percentage of these receptors triggered. As the number increases, that is the basis for the development of tolerance to narcotics. In other words, you need to take more opiates and narcotics to fill the same relative percentage of receptors if there are more receptors in your body. And finally, if your receptors are used to being filled with the narcotic because you're taking one chronically, if those receptors are empty, they are unhappy. You will start to have cravings for the medication, and then if you don't get it, you will actually have symptoms of withdrawal. Now, while there are several medical approaches to addiction, I'd like to go over two of them in particular that have some good data behind them. The first is what we call replacement or maintenance therapy with a narcotic, such as methadone. Your body requires the narcotic, so rather than have you go out on the street and obtain it, you can go to a clinic on a daily basis to get a supervised dose of methadone that will stop the withdrawal. Now, two things. A taper with this is possible, even though it's called maintenance therapy. They can gradually reduce your dose over time, although most just keep you on a steady dose. The other problem is that by law, you have to have a supervised dose on a daily basis for a period of time. With good compliance, you can earn the right to have take-home doses for up to a week at a time, but it requires an awful lot of going to the clinic. Methadone clinics are required to have special licensing. You have certain staffing requirements that are made, and you have to have medicine on site. A second approach is what they call a Data 2000 waiver, which is an office-based treatment system that any physician can have. It involves a weak opiate called buprenorphine, which fills the mu receptors but does not elicit an effect. When used properly, it stops the cravings but does not produce the euphoria, allowing you to wean off with careful management. This does require special training, which lasts about 8 hours, and a special license from the Drug Enforcement Agency. Patients can fill their prescription for up to a 30-day supply at a local pharmacy and continue on with their daily lives. In both methadone maintenance and buprenorphine treatment, supportive counseling to treat the root of the addiction is suggested. Unfortunately, there is a tremendous stigma with addiction to narcotics. In fact, you can even see YouTube videos mocking people that are addicted to narcotics. Let's go over a couple of these. First of all is well, just quit. You chose to start, you can choose to stop. This fails to take into account that narcotic addiction is a physical change to both your body with the number of mu receptors and your thinking processes. Trying to simply quit just forces people into withdrawal and makes them suffer, and then they relapse and fail. The second is it's their own fault. It's a mental weakness. It's a lack of moral character on their part, and they deserve to suffer. Most people are hypocrites because what they'll do is they'll say it's their own fault and then not mention the fact that as a result they should suffer. They want the personal satisfaction of feeling superior and causing other people to suffer without just overtly saying it. Now, another criticism that's pretty common and kind of tough to get over is trading one addiction for another. While this has some justification, in reality what we're doing is we're trading uncontrolled behavior for controlled behavior. We're also getting the patients into recovery counseling and reducing the number of overdose deaths. Now, another problem that is just a symptom of society is that drug addicts are not like us. That means that they're darker than we are and poorer than we are. Having treated addiction for a number of years now, I can assure you that the people that are addicted to narcotics are the people sitting next to you in church, standing next to you in the line at the pharmacy, or working for you. They are your friends, your neighbors, and sometimes your family members, and perhaps even yourself. They are exactly like you, and in fact, maybe you. And if it hasn't touched your life personally, it may in the near future. Finally, we have a perception that treatment doesn't work. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have very effective treatments for addiction now. Now, let's talk about a couple of the problems. The first one is the availability of methadone treatment programs. This is my state of Michigan. I think you can identify a problem right away, and that is that there's nothing in the northern half of the state, nor in the upper peninsula of Michigan, as far as methadone treatment programs. If your only form of medical insurance or means is Medicaid, your treatment options are limited even more than this. Not only is licensure very difficult to obtain, communities tend to resist the addition of a methadone clinic to their community. This goes back to the original problem that people have with these programs, and that is that drug addicts are not like us. And we don't like these undesirable people coming in from Flint and Detroit to our idyllic community. In reality, the people that are in their Rockwellian communities are the ones that suffer because they don't have a place to go. Now let's take a step back and see if we can stop the problem before it happens, and that is by managing our opiate use better. Narcotics should be primarily viewed as emergency medicines used for short term. Say, for example, you have a tooth pulled. At most, you should need a little boost of pain control for 2 or 3 days, not a month. The other thing that I have a problem with is the concept of scheduled medicine versus an as-needed medicine. For an as-needed medicine, you give a dose, 1 tablet of hydrocodone, for example, and a minimal interval between doses every 4 to 6 hours as needed. That does not mean you take a pill every 4 to 6 hours like clockwork until they're all gone. If I wanted to have you do that, I would tell you it is a scheduled medicine and I want you to take it every 4 to 6 hours until the dose is gone. I would carefully counsel you on which of the two I wanted you to do. I used to constantly scratch my head when I would get patients that come in with a dose of Vicodin 4 times a day as needed, and they would give them 120 a month. If I wanted you to have an as-needed medicine, I'd counsel you on that, and I'd make sure that you knew that you got 30 tablets, and that had to last you a month. The purpose of this was not to deny you pain control, but to impress upon you the fact that these pills are rather precious and they're only to be used in emergencies. Now let's talk about weaning for a minute. Recall that I said that when you take these medications chronically, the mu receptors in your body increase. Part of a good weaning program is giving those receptors a chance to what we call downregulate back to normal or heal. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Now, if we look at how we're going to wean people off, you have a certain amount of mu receptors in your body. Once we take enough narcotic to fill a certain percentage of those, they're happy and they're triggered. Now, what will happen is as you go on, the number of mu receptors will start increasing, and the amount of narcotic that you have to take to fill them up will go up with it. Now, what we do when we start weaning people off is we go ahead and we drop the amount of narcotic that they have to take in a step. Now that will cause the number of mu receptors to start coming down. But as there's a gap here versus that, versus this, right here, we're going to get mild withdrawal. Now, that'll be kind of like flu. And that'll go away as the number of receptors come back down to equalize again. Then what we do is we drop it again, and the same thing responds. See, we got the gap again here, and then it slows down there. And we continue doing this in a stepwise fashion until we can wean off. And what will happen is the number of receptors will start coming back down to a normal range again. This is what we refer to as healing the receptors. Now, it takes time. We drop about 20 to 25% per month. Takes a total of 8 to 12 months. Because what will happen is this shows that you're really working at this and you're dropping every single month to come down. But say by the time you get to about right here, you need a little break. So what we'll do is we'll extend that out for a second month. And then we'll start dropping it. And what that'll do is that'll let you ease off here, and then it'll start coming down again. Now, I'm not the only physician with an opinion on this, but I am a physician and I do have an opinion. And here's mine. Don't start somebody on narcotics without having an end game to get them off of those narcotics. Anticipate that everything may not go perfectly as you planned and be able to treat withdrawal and the symptoms associated with it. Weaning a patient is kind of like cooking pork or chicken. You don't get extra points for turning up the flame and cutting the cooking time. Your chances of successfully weaning your patient is directly related to your willingness to spend the time it takes to do it. Cutting pain medicine more than about 25% per month on somebody that has developed tolerance and dependency is pushing it too much. Finally, if you're going to prescribe narcotics, follow through and get your X license from the DEA so that you can use buprenorphine. My attitude is that starting somebody on narcotics involves risks, and if those risks come to fruition, you need to be able to deal with them. Most states now have a prescription reporting process. My policy was always that every time a pain patient came into my office, I would pull their MAPS report and review it. That report tells me every prescription for a controlled substance that patient filled in my state from any doctor at any pharmacy. We also monitor that patients are actually taking the prescribed medicines with urinalysis and to make sure they're not taking anything else. We review their risk factors for addiction. We realize that some patients take longer to wean than others, but we expect all patients to be making progress. It is difficult to get off of narcotics and a lot of work for the patient and the doctor. Occasionally we build in rest periods of a month or two to just kind of give them a chance to catch their breath. And as always, good medical management and record keeping is essential. Well, there's a lot to addiction, and I'll probably be doing some follow-ups based on viewer comments. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that on the list of future episodes. Well, thank you for stopping by. This is Dr. Bob signing out from Northern Michigan. I hope that you were able to get something from this, and we'll talk again soon. Well, guys, it's getting late here. Probably going to head on out. I'm going to shut the stream down now. I think one of the things that I'll probably do is maybe stream a couple of times when I'm taking some of those long drives up to the UP. I may also do a couple on Thursdays. You know, just have a look Thursday evening, and I'll probably have some going on. So, thank you all for stopping by. I do very much appreciate those super chats. Those are kind of an unexpected little pleasure. It's a lot of fun doing these, and it's a hobby for me. You know, these microphones, this thing here was $130, so it's It's kind of nice to have a hobby that pays for itself a little bit. But I really enjoy having you guys by, and thank you very much for stopping in and making some great chat up here and asking great questions. So hopefully we'll do this again soon. Thank you very much. Y'all take care.